Hey, greetings everyone. It's Damien, aka Sleepy Reader, Sleepy Book Reader. And in this video, I wanted to talk about some of my favorite books over the years. So books that were favorite books at some point during my reading life, which at this point is about 53 years of being an avid reader. So it's all over the place, and many of those will be books that I might no longer even like, or in some cases even remember very well, but I remember they were kind of my golden books. But before I get into that, I just want to thank everybody for all the great comments and the subs and everything. It's really nice to have just dove into BookTube and already get a really nice response. I really appreciate it. And I feel like I'm off to a great start. Of course, I've had a bad cold, and that is what has kept me from doing this second official video for this channel. Because the very first video I put on this channel was a video I put on both my channels. I also have a comic book channel called Sleepy Reader 666. But anyway, so the idea here, well, there's all these top 10 books and people talking about their favorite books. There's some cool videos out there of people talking about their evolution as a reader. And I thought, oh, I'll just do a video about my favorite books at different times in my life, because that changes all the time, right? At least for a fickle sort of butterfly reader like me. By butterfly, I mean like I feel like I flit from flower to flower, from different reading buckets or different reading gardens, as the whims take me over the years. And but at any given time, I'm super passionate about certain books. And as I made up a list, there was like 23, 24, and it was really long, or maybe even longer than that. And I started realizing I've got to whittle this down. And I remembered the idea of the Golden Book, which I got from the author Gan Wolf, which he talks about, I think in a passage in the first book of the Book of the New Sun, the Shadow of the Torturer. And then he talks about it some more in this essay he wrote about the writing of the Shadow of the Torturer, called The Feast of St. Catherine. This is contained in Castle of Days, but it's actually, Castle of Days is a reprint of three smaller books. So it originally comes from a book called Castle of the Otter, which was a book he wrote about, I don't know, something weird just happened on my computer. It's a book he wrote about the writing of the first two books of the Book of the New Sun, the first two volumes. Or at least he was, at that point, had only published those two. But in the Feast of St. Catherine, he said, every writer worth his 2 cents hopes in some little corner of his mind, at least, that somewhere out there are a few people who will do more than read his book, pitch it away, and reach for the next one. People who will read and reread, study the cover, perhaps in search of some clue, shelve the book, and later take it out and just to hold. And so in my mind, there's this ideal of the book. And there are certain books, certain favorite books over the years that were slotted in my brain as that ideal book, at least for a while, sometimes a year, sometimes 10 years, sometimes a few months. When you're younger, a lot of stuff happens, right? Um, there was a time when could put the palm of my hand flat on the front of a tattered paperback called The Dying Earth and feel the magic seeping through the cardboard. Turgeon of Mur, Lian the Wayfarer, Tisaeus, Chun the Unavoidable. Nobody I knew had heard of that book, but I knew it was the finest book in the world. In the first volume of the Book of the New Sun, the old librarian, Master Alton, says, such a child eventually discovers on some low but obscure shelf the Book of Gold. You have never seen this book, and you will never see it, being past the age at which it is met. Now there, I'm breaking that idea, because I'm giving you the golden book from all different ages, and I still reach towards new golden books. Um, so and the some of these books, even though they were golden to me, might just seem like cliches of someone of my generation and my sex or social class or whatever. But to me, when I encountered them, and for some period of time, they were my golden book. And because so many of my books are in storage, I am going to show the covers as close to what the covers were when they were my golden book on the screen, unless a few of them I have copies with me, but most are in storage. So the very first one, I think I mentioned in my newbie YouTube tag video, was by Henry Treece. It was called Viking Dawn. Henry Treece was a British author who wrote a lot of young adult historical novels. And The Viking Dawn was the first book where I thought I was a reader. At least that's one of my memories. So to me, it's the gateway, the golden book that opened the golden door to reading, to being excited over novels. In fact, I've only done novels here. There were a few on my initial list. There were some nonfiction books, but I decided that complicated things in some way. So, yeah, I venerated the Viking Dawn book in my head, and I don't have a copy, and I need to get a hold of a copy. You don't find them lying around, because I guess I should reread it. I'm a little scared to, because that would have been what, back in, I think, 1970, would have been the summer of 1970 would have been when I read it. And then next, if memory serves, when I was 11, I discovered one shelf at the very bottom of a bookshelf in the small library in my small town, where all the books had a rocket ship on the spine. And there I found Dune by Frank Herbert. And I have read that book many, many times over my lifetime. The impact it made on my 11-year-old mind, when most of my science fiction at that point had been Edgar Rice Burroughs and that sort of stuff, which is great. But Dune was so far above that. Um, and it was magical. It was the book for a long time, or so it seems in my memory. And then the next big golden book to me was, so both Dune and this book, 100 Years of Solitude, are books that I've reread at different times during my life. And obviously I appreciate them in different ways, but they have not lost their luster for me. And sometimes I will state that the 100 Years of Solitude, I hate that cover actually, but this was the edition I got when I was 20 years old. Um, he must have just, maybe I was 21. He must have just won the Nobel Prize when I got this book, because it says he winner of the 1982 Nobel Prize. So anyway, or maybe this isn't my original copy, but close enough. Uh, this book always strikes me as magical. I'd say the first half of it feels more magical than the second half over time as I've reread it more. I love the opening sections are just amazing. But I don't know. Nothing else can quite replicate that feeling. You go to other magical realism and stuff, and it's great, but nothing quite has taken that place. And then another book that I've read, but I first discovered in my mid-30s. A lot of people probably known about this author all along, but somehow I completely missed out on his existence till my mid-30s. And the first book by him I read, well, I think it may or may not have been the first book by him that I totally fell in love with, was The Code of the Worcesters. This is actually a recent copy I bought of a kind of new, nice hardback edition, and I'm planning to reread it yet again. I have read it many times. I've read a lot of P.G. Wodehouse, and I still think this is his best book. It's his best constructed, silly, meaningless plot in some British manor house in some vague early 20th century era. And it's just a delight to read. This is the one where there's the silver cow creamer, and there's Roderick Spode of the the leader of the brown shorts, and the secret word eulalie. So I love this book, and I think in a way, this is my grown-up golden book. Uh, it seems like I've read it to my daughter twice, I think, at least once. Read it to myself many times. Okay, so I'm not doing this in order. Those were all kind of in order from my earliest book to some high points, but now I'm going back. Sometime in my very early teens, I stumbled across this book, Guns of Avalon. This is yeah, I just bought this, but this is the version that I found. I think I bought it. Memory is weird, but I think I bought it the year my family was living in Geneva, Switzerland, which would mean I was 14. But then I have another memory of like finding a magazine that was serializing the sequel to this when I was 14. So maybe I found it when I was 13. Anyway, it blew my mind. It wasn't, it looks kind of like King Arthur and Conan, but it wasn't at all like that. It just had such a different flavor, such a distinct narration. This is the second book in the Amber cycle. The first five books form one story in a sense, although it's also like a serial with cliffhangers and like, but it's also just this mind-bogglingly cleverly constructed fantasy world, and it's written in this really cool style that is, part hard-boiled fiction, like hard-boiled Raymond Chandler style stuff, and part sort of poetic flights of fancy. And it's quick and efficient. And as a kid, I did not realize it was a sequel. I just thought that Roger Zelazny was cleverly beginning in the middle of the action and filling you in along the way. And it kind of has an ending, although there's also a bit of a cliffhanger at the end, but it didn't occur to me for a while that there were going to be more books. I just took it for itself. And it was quite a while. Then I read some of the sequels to it, and I'm not sure if I read them in order. And it was a long time before I read the first book. And I thought the first book, Nine Princesses of Amber, which everyone generally says is the best book of the series, I thought it couldn't hold a candle to this one. Anyway, this was like the coolest fantasy novel for me for the longest time. And I'm planning to, and I've reread the Amber novels at different times in my life and listened to audiobooks and stuff. Planning to reread this book sort of on its own in an attempt to recreate that feeling, I guess. Silly, you cannot recreate feelings, but we keep trying, we keep reaching for it as we get older, right? To hold, it's almost like to be cohesive, to hold together the all the disparate parts of yourself and your life. You want them to connect back together, so you reach back to the past. Um somewhere somewhere before discovering the 100 Years of Solitude, Thomas Pynchon's V was kind of a golden book for me. And I think it has its roots in a English class I took in high school that was all very modern literature at the time. So we read Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49. And this would be 1977 or 78 when we read it. And we read Samuel Beckett, and I'm not sure who else we read now, but all very modernist. And I thought that was so cool, and it was mysterious, and you couldn't really understand what they were doing. And this was like the ultimate book for me. There were all these beautifully written chapters that didn't connect to each other, except characters with the letter V showed up in the stories. And I think there's more meaning to it. I had not reread it since then, but I've always been planning to. But I embraced the idea of its mysteriousness, that the Golden Book was a mystery book. It was a mystery. It was something that was tantalizing, almost out of reach. Yeah, so I look forward to rereading this too, but how many books can you reread? You gotta read some new books too. Um, okay, then at some point I accidentally discovered Charles Bukowski, who is probably now totally a cliche for some young males to think is a great author. But I found the first book of his I found was this giant fat collection of short stories that since has been split into two. And it was called Erections, Ejaculations, Exhibitions, and General Tales of Ordinary Madness. And it was so, at the time for me, it was so much the cry of the outsider, of the person who rejects society. And I loved that idea at the time. I haven't gone back and read much Charles Bukowski. I went after that book, but that was always my like ultimate thing. I mean, it had like so many short stories in it, very short stories, most of them quick flashes, and each one in its own way, was a spit in the eye of normalcy. And it probably would all seem sophomoric and stupid to me now, I'm guessing. I don't know for sure. I have reread bits of his poetry, and some of it I think is very good, um, especially early to middle period poetry by him. But yeah, so I don't know if I should reread that one. But it was, there was just so much of it, and it was like eating potato chips. I just read one story after another, and it was the golden book for a while. And then later, and sort of somewhere following that thread of V and Thomas Pynchon, was the book Steps by Jerzy Kosinski. It's not his most famous book, but it is his weirdest book. And does it have a plot at all? Is it a series of scenes out of the life of one character, or is there actually multiple characters you don't even know? And Jerzy Kosinski also played on the level of, like, are these all scenes from his real life? There was always a hint with Jerzy Kosinski's books that they were autobiographical, or at least most of them were hinted to be. Now, then there were a lot of controversies about him, and a lot of it was not autobiographical, at least in his most famous book, The Painted Bird, which he in particular wanted people to believe was autobiographical. But there's still a lot of truth in his books. There's a lot of power, it's craziness, and they're disturbing. They're kind of from the ugliest side of the 20th century, I guess. But Steps' wild structure that just seemed to be different steps from the parts of this person's life. And this person had gone through many extreme things: World War II, communist Poland, being a spy, being a jet setter. It was just wild stuff. Um, okay, and then as I grew older, my golden books were usually short books of short stories. And a big one for me was the very same Gene Wolfe, his first short story collection called The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories and Other Stories. This is the fantastic cover of the British paperback from, what's the publisher? Arrow. But I love that cover. And the stories in here, they have their mysteriousness. So there's a story in it called The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories. So that story itself is about stories, sort of. So typical Gene Wolfe playfulness or goofiness to call it And Other Stories and Other Stories for the book title. And a lot of these stories in here won Nebulas, and a lot of them were nominated for Nebulas, and each one is very different from all the others. And I think this is by far his best short story collection, and my favorite book of his of all time. And I went through it over and over again. I Xeroxed out some of my favorite stories and would send them in packets to friends. It was crazy. They probably all hated me for doing that. I think on the table of contents I have, yeah, I've put stars and checks next to things, as I was planning to make my own short story mixtape for my friends using these notes somehow. And that led me back to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, this collected short stories of his. I have dipped in and out of this over the years. I think my absolute favorite story, although it's unfair to choose just one, is called want to get the title right. Um, this is actually a collection of 3 books together. It's called The Very Old Man with the Enormous Wings. It's a short, surreal story. But I don't know, I was just entranced by all these short stories by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And then for a while, I fell under the spell of Ellen Gilchrist, who I just randomly discovered when I was at a job where I could pretty much listen to audiobooks all day long and do my job. So I was going, this was in the 90s, and I was going to the library and just looking for another audiobook that might be interesting. And I hit upon Victory Over Japan by Ellen Gilchrist. I'd never heard of her. Turned out there was a National Book Award winning collection of short stories. And all her short story collections kind of blend together in that there's recurring characters in different times of their lives. But there was just something about her voice which was so different to my experience. It was like I must have been in my early 30s when I discovered this. And it was this older, experienced woman, the voice of older, experienced women in the deep South, off in Louisiana. And I was just really entranced by it. Um, yeah, so that became my golden book of short stories for a while. And then there was Stones for Ibarra by Harriet Doer, another, I think, National Book Award winner. This one introduced to me in a book group that didn't last very long. And I can't remember any of the other books we read. But for a year or two, I reread Stones for Ibarra over and over again. And I felt maybe it connected to the magical realism in a weird way, because it's about a couple who moves to a small town in Mexico and tries and the sort of the cultural misunderstandings, but also this wistfulness. And it seemed to be a story about memory and aging, even though now I'm probably much older than the characters in the novel. But the novelist was, I think, in her late 60s or 70s when she wrote Stones for Ibarra. And it was in the shape of a series of vignettes or stories linked together. So it continued in that short story thing. And then another big golden book for me was Legends of the Fall by Jim Harrison, which I loved until they put out a movie a horrible movie, I thought, that adapted the title novella of Legends of the Fall was 3 novellas. Legends of the Fall, Revenge, and now I can't remember the name of the other one. Those 2 were my favorite, Revenge and Legends of the Fall. Again, I had no idea who Jim Harrison was. Later, he seemed to become a famous author, but I found this like on a table of remaindered books at like a department store somewhere. I want to say Woolworths, but that doesn't seem right. I don't know when it was published, Woolworths still existed, but a department store like Woolworths that just had a stack of remaindered books that were for $1, and I picked it up and looked at it, and I think I saw that the first story was named Revenge, and I thought, well, for $1, I'll buy this hardback, and then I fell in love with it. And Harrison has a lot of novella collections. He's a brilliant novellaist, and I've loved a lot of them. But the Legends of Fall always shone for me for quite a while, till that movie ruined the novella. And then another, maybe my last greatest novella collection love was Four Ways to Forgiveness by Ursula Le Guin, which again, memory is false because I thought I had reviewed it for a newspaper, but in preparing images for this a video, I found that it came out in 1996, but I didn't start reviewing books for newspapers till about 1999. I did it for a short period, maybe. Well, it trickled on until around 2008, but most of my reviewing I did around 99 through 2002. Anyway, so I never reviewed this book for a newspaper, but it's later Ursula Le Guin. Each story is so character focused, but also, in my mind, perfect in its science fiction setting and its thought experiment kind of aspect of science fiction. It's social science fiction, it's political science fiction, but those are thought experiments in sort of human history and human development. And I think the older Ursula Le Guin was a better writer, was more, there was more, even more beauty to her writing. I just really loved it. Um, so yeah, that covers most of it. But then I thought, how have I left out Voyage of the Dawn Treader? It's what, the third book in the original Narnia series before they changed it around based on chronology. But third book that C.S. Lewis wrote in the Narnia books. And I don't know, it has great characters, you know, Reepicheep, Eustace, the bad guy, uh, and a bunch of other great characters. There's a really cool dwarf character in there. I forget his name. I've read this book many times over the years. Now, here I've totally failed. I tried to read it to my daughter several times and she would lose patience with it, and I don't know why. Um, but I think of it as a golden book also of fantasy, and that idea of a voyage into an ocean that seems to never end, and you're just exploring further and further. It just seemed beautiful to me. And to me, it's C.S. Lewis's best book. But I love the whole Narnia series. Now, I can't remember. My dad, when we were very little, read us some Narnia books. I can't remember if I first read that book on my own or he read it to me, but I definitely have reread it on my own many times since. And yeah, and I probably will reread it again. And it just seems to me the perfect shape for a fantasy novel. Um, whereas where did it go? The Roger Zelazny fantasy novel kind of was a disruptor, kind of a twisting fantasy off in a different direction. I think in the golden ideal of fantasy, for me, it's the Voyage of Dawn Treader. And then, so there's one other memory of the most golden book of all, because I can't remember it. My dad was a professor at a small, sleepy liberal arts college, and he taught economics. But because of it being the kind of college it was, when seniors would do a senior thesis, they would have professors from outside of the department also read and I guess grade or evaluate the senior thesis. And one year, I don't know how young I was, 6 or 7, 8 possibly, uh, he brought home with him, it must have been in the spring or I feel like it was in the summer, but that doesn't make sense. So it must have been a warm spring. We sat outside and he read this novel or novella that was a student's senior thesis. And at the time, it seemed to me, and when I talked to the rest of my family, to all of them, to be one of the most wonderful fantasy stories ever. But now I can't remember anything about it. It's like that song Tribute by Tenacious D. This is a tribute to the greatest song ever written. This book seemed so good. And my dad did follow up years later to see if it ever got published, and it did not. But we don't even know his name anymore. My dad has passed away, but I don't know if he remembered the fellow's name after a certain amount of time. When I circled back, because in recent years I thought if we could find this guy, I should publish his novella or novel myself. All I actually remember is there was a traveling magician with a magic mirror, and that's all I remember. And it could have been just okay, although my parents thought it was very good too. But so it might have just been that experience of a few sunny days in the backyard with my father reading us this book with stuff that to us was utterly surprising and magical beyond imagining. So anyway, those are the golden books of from my life. Uh Maybe there'll be a few more golden books. And is it a good idea for me to reread them? I think things like um, well, the Dawn Treader is held up in my rereading, so we'll see. I guess maybe I'm most afraid to reread the Charles Bukowski. There might be some others. So thanks for going on this weird little journey with me, and I hope I'll be back soon. Talk to y'all later.